Right now, as you settle deeper into wherever you're resting, countless tiny fragments of matter are drifting into your body through two small openings in your face, entering in a slow and continuous stream that never really stops, not even while you sleep. These fragments are so small that billions of them could rest on the head of a pin without crowding each other, and they come from everything around you, the fabric beneath you, the air that has settled in the room over hours or days, the faint trace of whatever was cooked earlier, the paper of a book, the wood of a shelf, the dust that gathers quietly in corners no one thinks about. Your body is built to notice these fragments, to catch them and sort them and turn them into information, and it is doing this right now, in this very moment, whether or not you are paying any attention to it at all. And this is one of the strange and gentle truths we're going to sit with tonight. Your sense of smell is almost never off. It is one of the few senses that keeps working, quietly and faithfully, even while you drift toward sleep, even after you're fully under. Long after your eyes have stopped registering the shapes of the room, long after your ears have softened the sounds around you into a kind of distant hum, your nose continues its work, sampling the air, sending signals inward, deciding, moment by moment, whether anything deserves your attention. And yet, for all this constant, tireless activity, there is something curious about the smell of your own home. If you have ever come back from a week away, maybe visiting family, maybe traveling somewhere unfamiliar, you may have noticed that stepping through your own front door produces almost nothing. No immediate scent rises to greet you. The air feels, in a sense, blank. But if you were to walk into someone else's home instead, even a home that is clean, even a home that no one would describe as having any strong or unpleasant odor, you would likely notice something right away. Maybe it's something you couldn't quite name, a certain warmth, a certain mustiness, a hint of a particular soap or the wood polish, something distinctly theirs. Their home has a scent. Your home, somehow, does not, or at least, it doesn't seem to. This little puzzle is worth turning over slowly, because it touches on something deeper than dust and air. It touches on how your body decides what is worth noticing at all. Somewhere inside your nose, tucked high up in a space you rarely think about, there is a patch of tissue about the size of a large postage stamp, and within that small patch live millions of specialized cells, each one a tiny sensor tuned to catch specific kinds of airborne fragments as they pass through. When those fragments settle onto the right receptors, a signal fires, and that signal travels quickly, almost instantly, to a part of the brain that sits closer to the memory centers and the emotional centers than any other sense does. This is part of why a particular scent can pull up a memory so suddenly and completely, why the scent of a certain kind of bread or a certain kind of rain can put you, for just a moment, back in a kitchen, or a car, or a summer afternoon you hadn't thought about in years. Sound and sight take longer, more roundabout paths through the brain. Smell has a kind of shortcut, a nearly direct line to the oldest and most emotional parts of your mind. So if the system is this sensitive, this quick, this deeply wired into memory and feeling, why would it go quiet in the one place you spend the most time in? Why would the home you know best, the home filled with the most familiar collection of fragments in your entire life, be the one place that seems to produce almost nothing at all? Part of the answer, and only part, because we'll spend a good while tonight exploring this from several directions, has to do with a kind of quiet decision your nervous system makes without ever asking your permission. Your body is, in a very real sense, built to notice change more than it is built to notice steadiness. Think for a moment about the feeling of putting on a wristwatch first thing in the morning. In the instant it touches your skin, you feel it clearly. The weight,
the band, the small pressure against your wrist. But an hour later, if someone were to ask, you might have to check that it's even still there, because your skin has stopped reporting it. It hasn't fallen off. It hasn't stopped touching you. But your nervous system has decided, quietly and efficiently, that since nothing has changed, there's nothing urgent left to say. This same quiet, efficient decision happens constantly with smell. The receptors in your nose are extraordinarily good at catching new fragments in the air, fragments that weren't there a moment ago, fragments that might signal something worth knowing about. Food, smoke, a stranger nearby, a shift in the environment. But fragments that have been present steadily, for hours, for days, for years, slowly stop producing the kind of urgent signal that reaches your conscious mind. The system isn't failing. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do. And your home, more than almost any other place in your life, is a landscape of steadiness.
The particular blend of fragments in your home, the ones from your furniture, your habits, your cooking, the particular soap in your bathroom, the material your curtains are made from, the air trapped in your closets, all of these have likely been present, in more or less the same combination, for a very long time. Long enough that your nervous system, ever efficient, ever focused on what's new rather than what's constant, has quietly filed this particular blend away as background information, not gone, not unnoticed at the deepest levels, simply no longer flagged as urgent enough to rise to the surface of your awareness. Meanwhile, someone else's home carries an entirely different blend, one your nose has never adapted to, one that still counts, from your body's perspective, as new, and so it rises to the surface immediately, the way any change does. There's something almost tender about this, if you sit with it for a moment. It means that the very fact your home doesn't smell like anything to you, in the way it clearly does to a visitor, is a kind of quiet evidence of how completely you belong there. Your body has stopped treating your own home as something to be alert to, because it has decided, patiently, gradually, fragment by fragment over months or years, that this particular blend of air is simply what safety smells like. It is the smell equivalent of a sound so constant you've stopped hearing it, like the low hum of a refrigerator in another room, or the quiet rush of a highway a few streets away. Sounds that were there all along, faithfully entering your ears, but that your mind long ago decided didn't need reporting. But this explanation, satisfying as it is really just the surface of a much deeper and more layered mystery, one we're only beginning to unfold tonight. Because if this were the whole story, if it were simply a matter of your nose growing quietly used to steady things, then a visitor stepping into your home for the very first time should be able to describe your home's scent to you clearly, the way you can describe theirs, and sometimes they can. But often, curiously, even people who've never set foot in your home before struggle to name exactly what they're noticing. It isn't always a single, describable scent, the way a bakery has the scent of bread or a garden has the scent of soil after rain. It's something softer, something harder to pin down, something that seems to exist just at the edge of language. And that raises a whole new question, one that has as much to do with how your brain builds smells out of countless fragments as it does with how your nose adapts to what's familiar. So as you continue to rest here, breathing slowly, breathing easily, let yourself sit with this small, quiet puzzle for a while. Somewhere in the air around you right now, an entire invisible mixture is settling into your lungs and drifting past the sensors in your nose, a mixture so familiar to your body that it has stopped announcing itself, even as it continues, faithfully, to arrive. And in a little while,
We'll gently follow that mixture further, tracing what it's actually made of, how a scent is built at all, and why the very idea of something having a smell is far stranger and far more layered than it first appears.
Let's follow that mixture, slowly, the way you might follow a single thread of steam rising from a cup left on a table. Because before we can understand why you stopped noticing your home's scent, it helps to understand just how much there actually is to notice, how many small and separate things are quietly contributing to that one soft, wordless impression that a stranger might struggle to describe. A home, any home, is never scented by a single source. It is not like a candle, burning one fragrance into a room. It is more like a orchestra, if you'll allow a gentle image, with dozens of instruments playing very quietly at once, so quietly that no single one stands out, and yet together they make a sound, or in this case a smell, that is unmistakably, distinctly itself. Think, for a moment, just about the people who live in a space. Human skin is host to an enormous and largely invisible community of bacteria, harmless in almost every case, simply going about the business of being alive on the surface of you. These microorganisms feed, in part, on the natural oils your skin produces, and as they do, they release small molecules into the air, faint compounds that drift upward from your arms and your scalp and settle, eventually, into the fabric of the couch you favor, the pillow you sleep on, the collar of the sweater hanging by the door. Every person's particular population of these skin bacteria is slightly different, shaped by genetics, by diet, by the soap they use, even by the climate they grew up in. Which means that every person, without ever trying, without ever intending to, is quietly perfuming the space around them in a way that is almost as unique as a fingerprint, though far softer, far less deliberate. Two people can shower with the same soap, sleep in the same climate, and still leave behind a faintly different trace in the air, the way two pianists playing the same simple melody will still sound, if you listen closely enough, like themselves. And that is only the people. Consider, too, what a home is built from, what it is filled with, quite apart from anyone living inside it. Wood releases scent, especially when it's new, or when it's been recently sanded or varnished, slowly giving off the resins and oils that were once part of a living tree, sometimes for years after it was first cut. Wool carries the memory of the sheep it came from, and of the lanolin worked into it during processing, especially when it's warmed by sunlight or by a body settling into a chair. Leather, whether on a couch or the spine of an old book, releases its own particular blend of aldehydes as it slowly ages, which is part of why old libraries and old furniture stores have that hushed, papery, faintly sweet smell that so many people find, without quite knowing why, deeply comforting. Even paint, long after it has dried and the sharpest chemical edge has faded from the air, continues to release trace amounts of its ingredients for a surprisingly long time, in quantities far too small to notice consciously, but not too small to register somewhere in the mixture. Now layer onto that the textiles. Every carpet, every curtain, every cushion in a home is, in a very real sense, a kind of sponge, though not for liquid so much as for scent itself. Fabric has an enormous surface area when you consider it thread by thread, and that surface area is remarkably good at trapping airborne molecules and holding on to them, releasing them slowly back into the room over hours, days, sometimes weeks. This is why a sweater can still smell faintly of a specific dinner, a specific fireplace, a specific rainy afternoon, long after the event itself has passed.
Your curtains are doing this constantly, and so is your mattress, and so is the rug beneath your feet, each of them slowly absorbing and slowly releasing a little of whatever passes through the air around them. Cooking smells, candle smoke, the damp mineral scent that drifts in after rain, perfume, the outdoor air itself. A home's textiles are, in this sense, a kind of quiet archive, holding faint traces of ordinary days that were never written down anywhere else. And then there is cooking, which might be the most obviously fragrant contributor of all, and yet even here, the truth is more layered than it first appears. It isn't only the smell of a meal while it's being made that lingers. Cooking releases countless volatile compounds into the air, some of which drift away quickly, and some of which settle into walls, into cabinet wood, into the porous surfaces of a kitchen, staying long after the pan has been washed and put away. A kitchen where someone has cooked with a particular spice for years, cumin, say, or garlic, or a certain kind of chili, will often carry a faint trace of that spice indefinitely, worked so thoroughly into the surfaces of the room that no amount of airing out fully removes it, and no amount of familiarity lets the people living there notice it anymore, even though a visitor sometimes can faintly, in the first few seconds after walking in, before their own nose begins the same quiet process of adjustment. Cleaning products add their own layer too, which is a strange thing to consider, because cleaning is meant to remove scent, and yet almost every cleaning product leaves a small trace of itself behind, even as it does that work. The particular brand of detergent used on the laundry, the surface spray used on the counters, the specific wood polish or floor cleaner favored in a household, these all carry their own scent signatures, usually built from a blend of synthetic fragrance compounds designed to smell clean, or citrus or floral, or simply fresh, and traces of these compounds linger in fabric and on surfaces well after the cleaning itself is finished. Which means that even the smell of cleanliness, that crisp, bright, almost blue-tinted impression some homes carry, is itself a chosen scent, manufactured somewhere in a lab, chosen off a shelf, and unknowingly added to the layered mixture that makes a home smell like itself. If there are pets in the home, they add still another layer, one that's easy to underestimate if you've lived with the same animal for years. A dog's fur holds oils and skin cells and the residue of whatever it has recently walked through or rolled in, and even a very clean, very well-groomed dog releases a faint, warm, slightly musky scent that becomes part of the household air. Cats do this more subtly, but not less completely. Even fish tanks and bird cages contribute their own small, specific notes, the mineral tang of aerated water, the dry, seedy warmth of a bird cage lined with fresh paper. None of these smells announce themselves individually to someone who lives with them every day. But they are there, chemically, physically, undeniably there, drifting through the air alongside everything else. Even the living plants in a home are quietly contributing, releasing trace amounts of the compounds that give them their particular green, growing scent, especially after watering, when moisture on soil and leaf briefly intensifies what the plant is releasing into the air. And running beneath all of this, connecting it, moving it, sometimes concentrating it and sometimes dispersing it, is the home's ventilation, the way air actually moves from room to room, whether through open windows, through the quiet mechanical breathing of a heating or cooling system, or simply through the small persistent drafts that exist in almost every building, however well sealed it seems.
Humidity plays its own role here too, because damp air holds and carries certain scent molecules differently than dry air does, which is part of why a home can smell subtly different on a humid summer evening than it does in the dry chill of winter, even if nothing inside it has changed at all. And outside all of this, quite literally outside, is the outdoor air itself, endlessly seeping in through the smallest gaps, carrying with it the scent of the specific street a home sits on, the specific season, the specific soil and trees and nearby industry or nearby sea, so that even a home's outdoor surroundings become, in some small ongoing way, part of its indoor signature. Put all of this together: the people, the materials, the cooking, the fabric, the cleaning products, the pets, the plants, the moving air, the humidity, the world just outside the walls, and you begin to see that a home's scent was never one thing to begin with. It was always dozens of things, faint and overlapping, each easy to miss on its own, and yet together forming something distinct enough that a stranger, stepping in for the very first time, can sometimes sense that something is there, something specific, something particular to this place and no other, even if they can't quite find the word for it. Which brings us, gently, to a stranger question still, the question of what a smell actually is in the first place, down at the smallest, most physical level, and how something so invisible, so weightless, so easy to overlook, comes to be built at all. Let's slow down and look at what a smell actually is, down at the level where physics turns into biology, because the answer starts somewhere almost embarrassingly small. A smell begins with a molecule, not an idea of a molecule, not a metaphor, but an actual physical object, small enough that trillions of them could rest on the head of a pin, light enough to drift on the faintest current of air, and shaped, always, in some particular way that matters more than almost anything else about it. These are what scientists call volatile compounds, and the word volatile here doesn't mean dangerous, it simply means willing to leave. A volatile molecule is one that doesn't want to stay locked inside a solid or a liquid. It wants to escape into the air, and it does, constantly, quietly, from the moment it exists. Think of a cut lemon sitting on a counter. The lemon itself is not becoming smaller in any way you could notice with your eyes, not in the first few minutes, but at the molecular level, something is already leaving it. Certain compounds in the lemon's oil, ones with names like limonene, are light enough and loosely enough bound that they lift off the surface of the fruit and enter the air as an invisible mist of individual molecules, spreading, thinning, drifting toward whatever nose happens to be nearby. This is happening right now, in some form, all across the home. Wood releasing faint traces of the resins it was built from, dust releasing fragments of skin and fabric and mineral, coffee grounds from this morning still giving up the last of their aromatic oils. All of it invisible, all of it silent, and all of it made of these small, drifting, volatile molecules, each one a tiny physical traveler with nowhere in particular to be, except away from where it started. Now, a molecule floating through the air of a room isn't a smell yet. It's only a potential smell, a physical object waiting for something to happen to it. And what has to happen is startlingly intimate when you slow down and look at it closely. That molecule has to find its way into your nose, up through the nostril, past the fine hairs that filter out larger particles, and into a space at the top of the nasal cavity that most people never think about, a patch of tissue no bigger than a postage stamp, tucked high up, almost between the eyes. This patch is called the olfactory epithelium, and it is, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest pieces of tissue in the entire human body. Here is where the invisible becomes physical again, because the surface of this tissue is not dry. It's coated in a thin layer of mucus,
And that mucus turns out to be essential, not incidental. The volatile molecule drifting through the air has to dissolve into this thin, wet layer, the way a grain of sugar has to dissolve into water before your tongue can register it as sweetness. Smell, it turns out, is not really a sense of air at all, not in its final step. It's a sense of solution, of one substance dissolving into another, just as taste is. The dry, airborne world outside your body has to become briefly, locally wet before it can mean anything to your nervous system. This is part of why a stuffy nose blunts smell so effectively. It isn't just blocking airflow, it's changing the mucus itself, thickening it, altering how easily molecules can dissolve into it and reach what's waiting underneath. And what's waiting underneath, just beneath that thin, wet layer, are the receptor cells, millions of them, each one a genuine neuron, a true extension of the brain, sitting astonishingly close to the outside world, separated from open air by nothing more than a film of mucus a fraction of a millimeter thick. This is worth pausing on, because it's unusual. Most of your neurons are buried deep, cushioned by bone and tissue and distance. These olfactory neurons are not. They are, in a very real anatomical sense, brain tissue exposed almost directly to the environment, replaced and renewed every few weeks, precisely because they take this kind of exposure and wear so directly. Each of these neurons carries, on its surface, a particular kind of receptor protein, a molecular shape built specifically to catch other molecules that fit it. And this is where the mechanism becomes almost mechanical, almost like a lock, built to catch not just one key, but a whole family of similarly shaped keys. A single receptor protein isn't tuned to one single scent molecule alone. It responds, more loosely than that, to molecules that share certain features of shape and size and chemical charge, the way a particular kind of lock might accept several keys that are roughly, but not exactly, alike. The molecule from that lemon, drifting through the air, might fit snugly into one kind of receptor, loosely into another, and not at all into a third, and this pattern of fitting, tight here, loose there, absent elsewhere, is the very first code being written. Humans carry several hundred different types of these receptors, each one a slightly different lock, each one tuned to a slightly different range of molecular shapes. And here is the part that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, slowly explained. A single scent molecule almost never activates just one receptor type. It usually activates several at once, in different strengths, like a chord struck across many keys of a piano, rather than a single note played alone. The scent of a lemon isn't one receptor lighting up, it's dozens of them, some strongly, some faintly, each contributing its own small signal, together forming something more like a pattern than a point. This is the reason humans can distinguish an almost bewildering number of different smells, despite having a comparatively modest number of receptor types. It isn't about matching each smell to its own dedicated receptor, the way a single key opens a single lock. It's combinatorial, meaning the meaning comes from the combination itself. Change the exact mixture of receptors activated, change the relative strength of each one's response, and you get a different perceived smell entirely, even if many of the same receptors are involved in both. It's a little like how a limited set of letters can be arranged and rearranged into an almost unlimited number of words. The alphabet stays the same. What changes is the pattern. Once a receptor is activated, it sends an electrical signal down the length of its neuron, a small and specific pulse of information, and that signal travels a remarkably short distance, up through a thin bony plate at the base of the skull called the cribriform plate, into a structure just above it called the olfactory bulb. This is the first place in the brain where all these separate signals begin to gather. Neurons carrying signals from the same type of receptor tend to converge on the same small cluster of tissue within the bulb, so that even though the original activation was spread across a wide sheet of tissue in the nose, it arrives in the brain sorted, organized, gathered into distinct little knots of activity, each one representing a particular receptor type's contribution to the overall pattern. And so, by the time a scent has truly arrived, in any meaningful sense, in the brain, it has already been transformed several times over. It began as an object, a physical molecule drifting through the air of a room. It became a dissolved substance, briefly liquid, briefly still. It became a set of tightly and loosely fitting locks, a scattered cord struck across hundreds of possible receptor types. And now, in the olfactory bulb, it becomes something closer to a map, a spatial pattern of activated clusters, arranged almost like a fingerprint unique to that particular molecule, or mixture of molecules. This patterned map is what gets passed onward into the rest of the brain, and it's worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it means that what you perceive as a single simple smell, the smell of your own kitchen, say, or your own pillow, is never actually simple at all. It is built, quietly and completely, from this layered sequence of dissolving, fitting, and patterning, all of it happening in a space smaller than a fingertip, every single time you breathe in.
Now, here is where the story bends towards something quietly strange, something that happens after that first pattern arrives, after that fingerprint of activity lights up in the olfactory bulb. Because the pattern does not simply stay lit, it fades. And the fading is not the brain losing interest in some vague, poetic sense. It is a specific, traceable, biological event happening at the level of individual cells, and it happens remarkably fast. Think about what occurs in the first fraction of a second after a receptor is activated. A molecule settles into its pocket, its lock, and the receptor changes shape just slightly, just enough to trigger a cascade inside the cell, a rush of charged particles moving across a membrane, and that rush is what becomes the electrical signal, the pulse sent down the neuron toward the brain. This is a strong opening. It is, in a real sense, the loudest the signal will ever be. The first breath you take of a new environment, the first inhale after walking into a bakery or a hospital or a stranger's living room, produces the fullest version of that electrical response. The receptors are, in effect, meeting the molecule for the first time, at least in a functional sense, and they respond the way anything responds to a genuinely new event, fully, urgently, without restraint. But almost immediately, something begins to change inside the cell. The same molecular machinery that made the response possible starts, very quickly, to work against its own continuation. Certain proteins involved in the signaling cascade become less available, or shift their behavior, or trigger feedback loops that dampen the very cascade they were part of a moment before. It's a little like a hand clapping. The first clap is sharp, loud, unmistakable. If you kept clapping at exactly the same pace and force, over and over, your ears would still register each clap. But something else happens if that same sound continues steadily, unchanging, for long enough. Attention drifts. The sound doesn't stop, but the noticing of the sound quietly recedes. Something similar, though built from very different materials, happens inside an olfactory receptor cell exposed to a steady, unchanging concentration of an odor molecule. The molecule is still there. The receptor is, in a narrow biochemical sense, still binding it. But the electrical signal produced by that binding grows smaller, second by second, until it settles into something far quieter than where it began. This is called adaptation, and it's worth being precise about what kind of adaptation this is, because there are several kinds happening at once in your nose and brain, at different speeds and different levels, and this particular one, this receptor level fading, is one of the fastest and most local. It doesn't require thought. It doesn't require the brain deciding anything. It happens down at the very beginning of the chain, inside cells so small and so specialized that their entire purpose in life is to greet one narrow category of airborne molecule, and then, if that molecule keeps showing up in the same steady way, to gradually stop shouting about it. There is something almost economical about this, if you allow yourself to think of a nervous system as something that has to budget its resources. A receptor cell that fires with full intensity at every single moment a molecule happens to be present would be, in a sense, wasting a great deal of energy and attention on information that has already been delivered. The first signal says, something new is here. The second identical signal, arriving a moment later under identical conditions, says nothing new at all. It is, biologically speaking, redundant. And so the cell, through this quiet cascade of changing proteins and shifting thresholds, begins to treat repetition itself as a kind of instruction to quiet down. It helps to imagine an old lighthouse keeper, someone whose entire job for decades was to notice ships. Say this is the middle of the 19th century, a rocky coast, a small stone tower, a keeper who has trained himself, over years, to glance out at the water on some rough internal schedule and register whether anything is out there that shouldn't be. If a ship appears on the horizon that has never been there before, he notices immediately, sharply, the way your receptors notice a genuinely new smell. But if that same ship anchors just offshore and stays there, unmoving, for 3 straight days, his attention to it does not remain at that same sharp pitch. He still knows it's there, in some background sense. He could tell you the count if asked. But his eye, scanning the horizon each morning, is drawn instead to anything that has changed. A second ship, a shift in the first ship's position, a fire lit on its deck. The unchanging thing recedes not because it has vanished, but because a mind, or in this case a receptor, calibrated to detect change, treats an unchanging thing as no longer requiring the same level of report. This is, at a cellular scale, essentially what is happening every time you walk into your own home and, within a minute or two, stop smelling it. The receptors that respond to whatever particular blend of molecules makes up the scent of your specific rooms, your specific furniture, your specific cooking habits and fabric softeners, and the particular way damp stone smells in your particular basement. All of those receptors fired strongly the moment you walked in. And then, because that exact chemical blend did not change, did not shift in concentration, did not do anything except remain steadily, boringly present in the air around you, those receptors began quieting their signal, one small biochemical step at a time, until the electrical pulse traveling up toward your olfactory bulb dropped to something so faint it barely registers as information at all. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the smell of your home has not gone anywhere. It has not gotten weaker, in any physical sense out there in the air. If someone else walked through your door right now, someone who does not live there, their receptors would fire exactly as strongly as yours did the very first time you crossed that threshold years ago. Nothing about the molecules has changed. What has changed is entirely inside you,
inside the small cluster of proteins and membranes that make up your particular receptor cells, cells that have, in their own limited and entirely automatic way, decided that this particular chord of molecules is no longer news. But here is the detail that keeps this story from becoming simply a tale of fading and forgetting, and it's an important one, because adaptation is not the same thing as blindness. If the composition of that air changes, even slightly, the story shifts immediately.
Say something starts to burn on the stove while you are sitting there, thoroughly adapted to the ordinary smell of your kitchen. The new molecules released by that burning, whatever they happen to be, arrive at receptors that were never adapted to them in the first place, because they were never present before in that concentration. Those receptors respond the way any receptor responds to something genuinely new, fully, sharply, without the dampening that comes from repetition. You notice it almost instantly, even while the ordinary background of your kitchen remains as invisible to you as ever. And there's a second layer to this as well, something that matters even for scents you've technically already adapted to. Certain molecules, particularly ones associated across a very long evolutionary history with genuine danger, things like smoke, or the sharp chemical edge of certain gases, or the specific unpleasant signature of spoiled food, seem to resist this fading in ways that milder, more neutral smells do not. The receptors and neural pathways involved in detecting these particular signals appear to be built, or at least biased, toward staying alert even under conditions of steady, unchanging exposure. It is not that adaptation fails to happen for these smells at all. It simply happens more slowly, more incompletely, leaving a persistent thread of signal that keeps quietly insisting on being noticed, long after a gentler scent would have gone silent. So the fading is never absolute, and it is never careless. It applies itself most fully to what is steady, familiar, and already known to be safe, and it loosens its grip the moment something changes, or the moment something carries even a faint chemical resemblance to the kinds of signals a body has, across a very long history, learned not to ignore. Which raises a natural question, one that carries us gently into what comes next. If the fading happens down here, at the level of single receptor cells and their small electrical pulses, is that the whole story, or is there something happening further along, somewhere deeper in the brain, that plays its own quiet part in why a home can become so completely, so peacefully, unsmellable? There is something further along, and it turns out to be at least as important as anything happening out at the very tip of the nose. Because if you were to somehow freeze a person's receptor cells in a permanently alert, fully firing state, and keep every one of those small electrical signals traveling faithfully up into the brain without any fading at the source at all, you would still, eventually, stop smelling your own kitchen. The dampening does not belong only to the receptors. It belongs, in a deep and important way, to the brain itself, and to the layers of neural tissue that sit between the raw signal and your conscious awareness of it. To understand this, it helps to picture the path a scent takes once it leaves the nose. The receptor cells, out on that small patch of tissue high in the nasal cavity, are really just the first checkpoint. When one of them catches a molecule and fires, that signal travels inward to a structure called the olfactory bulb, a small, paired swelling of neural tissue that sits just above the nasal cavity and just below the front of the brain. From there, the signal continues on to other regions, places with names like the piriform cortex and the amygdala, and structures tucked into the temporal lobe, areas that are involved not just in identifying what a smell is, but in deciding what it means, whether it deserves attention, whether it should rise up into the layer of experience you would actually call conscious smelling. And it is at these later stages, this deeper processing, where a second, entirely separate kind of fading takes place. Not a fading of the signal's strength, but a fading of its priority. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a genuinely different mechanism from the one we spent the last section exploring. Receptor adaptation, that gradual softening of response we talked about earlier, happens locally, almost mechanically, the way a muscle might tire from being asked to do the same small motion over and over. It is, in a sense, a property of the cell itself, something that would happen even in isolation, even if the rest of the brain were doing nothing at all with the information. But central habituation, the kind that happens up in the bulb and the cortex, is not mechanical in that same way. It is something closer to a judgment. It is the brain, at a level far below anything you would call conscious thought, quietly deciding that a particular pattern of incoming signal has already been evaluated, already been filed away as familiar and safe, and does not need to be re-evaluated every single time it shows up again. Think of it this way. Imagine a person whose job is to sit at a desk and read incoming reports, deciding which ones are urgent enough to send further up the chain and which ones can simply be filed. On the first day, every report gets careful attention, because nothing yet has a track record. But after weeks of the same daily report arriving, saying essentially the same thing each time, that person stops reading it word for word. They glance at the header, confirm it matches the pattern they already know, and set it aside without escalating it. The report is still arriving. Nothing about its contents has been altered or blocked. What has changed is the amount of processing attention it receives once it reaches the desk. The brain's handling of a stable, familiar background odor works in something like this way. The signal keeps arriving, checkpoint after checkpoint, all the way up through the olfactory bulb. But somewhere in that climb, it stops being escalated. It gets filed instead of read. This matters for a very specific reason, because it explains something that pure receptor fatigue alone cannot fully account for. If you were to measure the actual electrical activity coming out of a person's olfactory bulb while they sat in their own unsmellable living room, you would still find real activity there, meaningful patterns of firing corresponding to the actual chemical composition of the air. The information has not vanished. It is present in the wiring, in the traveling signal, in the parts of the brain built specifically to register it. But somewhere between that signal's arrival and its emergence into the sort of experience you could describe in words, something intercepts it and gently sets it down rather than carrying it forward. There is a useful concept from a much broader area of psychology that helps make sense of this, sometimes called the orienting response, sometimes described more simply as the brain's appetite for novelty. Human attention, across every sense, not just smell, is built to prioritize change over stability. A sound that starts suddenly pulls your focus far more powerfully than a sound that has been playing steadily the entire time you were in the room. A flicker of movement at the edge of your vision draws your eyes before a stationary object ever could, even if that stationary object is, technically, larger and closer. This is not a flaw in the system. It is, if anything, a remarkably efficient use of a limited resource. Attention itself is expensive, in the sense that a brain can only give rich, detailed processing to a small slice of everything arriving through its senses at any given moment, and so evolution appears to have shaped every sensory system
smell very much included, to spend that expensive resource on what is new, what is changing, what might require a response, rather than on what has already been checked and found to be unremarkable. And the home, of course, is very often the single most stable sensory environment a person moves through in an ordinary day. The scent of it, whatever particular blend of wood, fabric, cooking residue, skin, and time it happens to carry, does not arrive freshly each morning, the way a coworker's new coffee shop lunch might, or the way a friend's unfamiliar living room smells the first time you visit. It is there, unchanging, night after night, for months and often years. And so the brain, doing exactly what it is built to do, gradually stops flagging it as worth escalating, not because the smell is gone, not because it has been erased or blocked, but because, at some point long ago, the report stopped being new, and the desk simply stopped reading it in full. This is also, worth noting, part of why the effect can feel so total, so seamless, almost as though your own home genuinely has no smell at all, rather than a smell you have simply stopped registering. Because if this were only happening at the level of the receptors themselves, you might expect some faint trace of awareness to survive, some ghost of a signal that occasionally flickered into notice. But because the central habituation happens further along, at the level where raw sensation is converted into the kind of information you can actually think about and describe, the experience is closer to genuine absence. Not muted awareness of a familiar smell, but an almost complete absence of it from conscious experience altogether, even while, somewhere quietly upstream, the neural machinery is still doing its job, still tracking, still confirming, at some low and wordless level, that everything smells exactly the way it is supposed to. It is worth pausing here on one more small detail, because it softens something that might otherwise sound slightly unsettling. This filtering is not a failure of your brain, and it is not evidence that something has gone numb or broken. If anything, it is closer to evidence of a system working with real sophistication, one capable of learning, of building an internal model of what ordinary and safe actually smells like in your particular environment, and of trusting that model enough to stop demanding fresh verification every single time. A brain that insisted on fully processing every familiar smell with the same intensity as a brand new one would be a brain constantly, needlessly burdened, its attention scattered thin across 1,000 small signals that never actually required a response. The quiet unsmellability of your own home is, in a real sense, a kind of achievement, the visible mark of a nervous system that has learned your world well enough to stop worrying about the parts of it that never change. But learning of this kind is rarely instant, and it is rarely permanent in the way a simple on or off switch would be. It builds gradually, strengthens with repetition, and can, under the right circumstances, loosen again. Which brings us naturally toward another question worth turning over slowly in the dark, one that has less to do with molecules and receptors, and more to do with time itself. How long does this kind of learning actually take to settle in, and does it happen the same way, at the same pace, for every person, or every home, or is there something more variable, something almost personal, in how quickly a particular room stops announcing itself, and simply becomes the quiet, wordless backdrop of an ordinary life?
There is a temptation, when thinking about all this, to reach for a single word and let it carry the whole explanation. People say they are used to a smell, or that their nose has adapted, or that they have simply gone numb to it, and in casual conversation, these phrases move around interchangeably, as if they all pointed to the same quiet mechanism. But they do not exactly, and untangling them slowly, without any urgency, actually makes the whole picture clearer rather than more complicated. Start with adaptation, because it sits closest to the level of the individual receptor, down among the actual cells lining the upper reaches of the nasal passage. When an odor molecule locks onto a receptor, it triggers a small cascade of electrical and chemical events, a tiny burst of signaling that eventually gets sent inward toward the brain. But receptors, like most biological machinery that fires repeatedly, are not built for constant, undiminished output. Exposed to the same molecule again and again, in steady, unchanging concentration, the receptor's response tends to shrink, message by message, the way a struck bell rings loud on the first blow and then quieter and quieter still if you keep striking it at the same soft pace without ever letting it go fully silent. This shrinking is adaptation in its narrowest, most literal sense, a property almost of the hardware itself, something that begins within seconds of exposure and can partially reverse within seconds of the exposure ending. Habituation lives one level up, and it is less about the receptor tiring and more about the brain quietly deciding, over a longer stretch of time, that a particular signal does not deserve full attention. This is a learned adjustment, built through repetition, and it is the piece most responsible for the specific puzzle of not smelling your own home. It is not that your receptors have gone silent, not entirely, but that the signal, once it arrives centrally, gets treated as old news, filed away rather than flagged. Habituation can take shape over minutes, but the version that governs a household scent, the one baked into the walls and the fabric and the particular blend of whatever soap and whatever cooking and whatever pet or plant or old book collection happens to live there, is built over days and months and years, a slow sedimentary process rather than a quick one. Then there is sensory fatigue, a term people sometimes use as a rough synonym for adaptation, though it is worth holding slightly apart, because it points towards something a bit more general and a bit more physiological, a kind of overall dampening that can happen not just to a single receptor type, but across a wider stretch of the olfactory system when it is asked to work hard and continuously. Perfumers in the 19th century, long before anyone had language for receptors or neurons, already understood a working version of this. They spoke of the nose growing tired during a long session of blending, and they built in breaks, sometimes stepping outside, sometimes simply sniffing plain coffee beans or their own forearm, some neutral reference point meant to interrupt the fatigue and let the working sense recover before continuing. They were managing something real, even if the underlying biology stayed invisible to them, hidden inside a system nobody could yet examine directly. Masking is different again, and it is worth setting apart, because it is not really about your sensitivity changing at all. Masking happens when one smell, usually a strong or novel one, simply covers or interferes with your ability to notice another smell that is still there, still being detected, but crowded out by competition for the same narrow channel of attention or the same overlapping set of receptors. Walk into a home that smells faintly of a particular spice blend while carrying a coffee in your hand, and for a moment, the coffee can mask the spice entirely, not because your nose has adapted to the spice, but because the coffee is simply louder in that instant. Masking is temporary and situational, tied to whatever else happens to be in the air at that exact moment, and it says very little about the deeper habituation that governs how a home smells, or fails to smell, over the long run. And finally there is dilution, which is not really a property of the nervous system at all, but a simple fact of physics and geometry. A scent is a cloud of molecules dispersed through air, and the concentration of that cloud depends heavily on how much air there is to disperse into, how well that air circulates,
how often doors and windows open and close, how warm or cool the space is, since warmth tends to lift and spread molecules more readily than cold, still air does. A small closed room with poor airflow will hold a scent at a higher, more detectable concentration than a large open one with a window cracked to the outside. This has nothing to do with your brain deciding to stop noticing something. It has to do with how many molecules are actually available to be noticed in the first place. A question of supply rather than attention. These 5 things, adaptation, habituation, sensory fatigue, masking, and dilution, often overlap in real life, tangled together in a single ordinary moment, which is part of why the whole subject can feel so slippery to think through. Standing in your own kitchen, you might be experiencing genuine habituation to the deep, structural scent of the house itself, mild receptor-level adaptation to whatever you happen to be cooking at that exact moment, some degree of masking from the coffee in your hand, and a baseline level of dilution simply because the window happens to be open. All 4 processes, running quietly and simultaneously, contribute to the single, seamless experience of smelling almost nothing at all. Which finally brings us to the question of leaving, and why something as ordinary as stepping outside for the length of an errand can seem to reset the whole system so cleanly. Part of the answer is the simplest one, and it belongs to dilution, rather than anything happening inside your head. The moment you step outside, you are surrounded by an entirely different mixture of air, one with essentially none of your home's particular molecular signature drifting through it. There is nothing left to adapt to, nothing left to habituate against, because the stimulus itself has simply disappeared from your immediate surroundings.
Given a little time in that clean, unrelated air, whatever short-term adaptation had built up in your receptors, the kind operating on a scale of seconds to minutes, gets the chance to unwind, the struck bell falling silent and resetting itself so it can ring fully again the next time it is struck. But there is more happening than mere receptor recovery, especially if you are gone longer than a few minutes, long enough to run an errand, or sit through an appointment, or spend an afternoon somewhere else entirely. The brain's model of what counts as ordinary and expected also seems to loosen somewhat when the input that built it is withheld for a while, though this part of the picture is less precisely mapped by researchers than the receptor-level story, and estimates of exactly how quickly this looser, higher-level habituation fades vary depending on the study and the specific odor involved. Still, the general pattern is fairly consistent and easy enough to notice in your own life without needing a laboratory to confirm it. A brief absence, the length of a supermarket trip, mostly seems to reset the fast, receptor-level adaptation so that walking back through your own front door delivers a small, fresh puff of your home's scent before habituation reasserts itself within a minute or two of continued exposure. A longer absence, a full day away, or a week spent traveling somewhere else seems to reach further, loosening the deeper habituation as well, which is why returning from a real trip so often produces that unmistakable, almost startling moment of smelling your own house fully, sometimes for the first time in months, standing in the doorway with your bag still in your hands, breathing in something that used to be invisible to you and has, briefly, become vivid again. There is a kind of gentle symmetry in this, worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The same nervous system that quietly stops announcing your home to you day after day is also, all along, fully capable of announcing it again, the moment enough distance and enough time intervene to let the old signal register as new once more.
Nothing about your sense of smell has been lost in the meantime. It has simply been waiting, patiently, for the right kind of absence to remind it what it once found so worth mentioning. And that pattern of sensitivity fading and then returning after distance raises a further, quieter question, one that has less to do with going away and coming back, and more to do with what is happening to the smell itself while you are gone, whether a home's air, left undisturbed and unwalked through for hours, actually settles into something subtly different from the air you left behind.
It might help, at this point, to step back from the house itself and notice that this same quiet vanishing happens all over the body, in senses that have nothing to do with the nose, and that the comparison says something useful about what makes smell strange, even among these other examples. Think for a moment about the shirt you put on this morning. When the fabric first settled against your shoulders, there was a brief, specific awareness of it, the collar against the back of your neck, the seam somewhere near a shoulder blade, the particular weight of the material. And then, within a minute or two, all of that information simply stopped arriving. Not because the shirt changed, and not because your skin lost its ability to feel fabric, but because a set of receptors in the skin, called mechanoreceptors, the ones responsible for detecting steady, unchanging pressure, essentially decided the information was no longer worth the bandwidth. They kept firing at first, then slowed, then mostly stopped, handing the job over to a smaller number of receptors that only care about change, about new pressure or shifting pressure, the kind that might signal something worth reacting to. This is why you can, right now, in the middle of a sentence, bring the collar back into awareness just by thinking about it, the way a forgotten word surfaces when you go looking for it, and then feel it recede again within a few seconds once your attention wanders off. The shirt was never gone. Your access to it was simply gated by relevance, in almost exactly the way your access to your home's smell is gated. The refrigerator hum works a little differently, but ends up in a similar place. That low mechanical drone, which might be perfectly audible to a visitor walking into your kitchen, tends to disappear from your own awareness within what researchers studying auditory habituation have often estimated at somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds of steady, unchanging sound. The ear itself does very little of this filtering, unlike the nose, where actual receptor cells stop responding to a chemical. The eardrum and the tiny bones behind it continue vibrating in exact proportion to the hum, transmitting a signal that is, at the level of physics, unchanged. What changes is further up, in networks of neurons that specialize in noticing when a sound stays exactly the same for long enough that it stops being classified as information and starts being classified as background. It is a judgment call made largely outside conscious control, and it happens to almost every steady sound eventually: the hum of a laptop fan, the tick of a clock, the low static hiss some older buildings carry through their pipes. A guest's ear has not yet made that judgment call about your refrigerator. Yours made it years ago and remade it fresh again the last time the compressor cycled on after a silence. Eyeglasses offer perhaps the cleanest version of this pattern because the disappearing act is so total and so fast. Ask someone who has worn the same glasses for years whether they can feel the frames resting on the bridge of their nose and behind their ears, and most will say no, genuinely no,
not as a figure of speech, but as an accurate report of their moment-to-moment experience, right up until the question itself drags the sensation back into awareness, at which point it becomes suddenly, almost comically obvious, impossible to ignore for the next several seconds. This particular kind of fading has a name, tactile adaptation, and it tends to be quick, often measured in the range of a few seconds to perhaps a minute, for a stable, unchanging pressure applied to relatively insensitive skin, like the bridge of the nose. It is the same mechanism at work in the shirt collar, but faster and more complete, in part because the pressure from a well-fitted pair of glasses is so perfectly steady without the small shifts of a moving fabric that the nervous system finds it even easier to file away as irrelevant. Room temperature follows a gentler version of this same arc, though it tends to unfold over a slightly longer stretch of time, more like 10 or 15 minutes than 10 or 15 seconds. Step into an air-conditioned building from a hot afternoon, and the coolness registers immediately, sometimes almost as a small shock. Sit there working or talking for a while, and that coolness gradually stops registering as coolness at all, becoming simply the felt sense of what normal is, until stepping back outside into the heat produces, again, that same little jolt, this time in the other direction.
The thermoreceptors in the skin are, in this case, responding to a genuinely more complicated signal than steady pressure or steady sound, since temperature involves an actual ongoing process of heat transfer between skin and air, but the underlying principle holds. Change is loud, steadiness is quiet, and the nervous system spends its limited attention on the former. And then there is your own perfume, or cologne, or the particular soap you have used every morning for the last decade, which brings the comparison directly back to smell and, in doing so, reveals something the other examples cannot quite capture on their own. Ask most people who wear the same fragrance daily whether they can smell it on themselves by mid-morning, and the honest answer is usually no, not without leaning down and inhaling deliberately from a wrist or a collar, the way you might reach for a sensation that has gone quiet. This happens for the same essential reason your home goes quiet. Receptor-level adaptation to a steady chemical signal, likely compounded by the same higher-level habituation that dampens familiar background smells more generally. But perfume adds a layer the other senses do not have quite as vividly, because smell, more than touch or hearing or temperature, is unusually good at carrying emotional weight and unusually bad at being described in words. A person can tell you precisely how a shirt collar feels, using ordinary vocabulary borrowed from touch itself: tight, scratchy, soft, warm. But ask someone to describe a smell without comparing it to something else, without saying it smells like rain or bread or a hospital, and most people find themselves oddly stuck, reaching for other senses' words, because smell seems to have so few of its own. Researchers who study this gap have often pointed to the way olfactory information travels through the brain, arriving at structures involved in memory and emotion, the amygdala and hippocampus among them, by a comparatively short and direct route, before it ever reaches the regions responsible for language and conscious labeling, which sit further downstream and seem to receive a comparatively thinner, less detailed version of the signal. Sound and touch and temperature pass through more elaborate relay stations on their way to conscious awareness, picking up vocabulary and categories as they go. Smell arrives faster and rawer,
more feeling than description, which may be part of why a single unexpected whiff of a particular soap can deliver a wave of specific, dated memory, a childhood kitchen, a grandmother's coat closet, a summer that ended decades ago, with a suddenness that a remembered sound or texture rarely matches. This combination, fast neural wiring toward emotion and comparatively thin wiring toward language, may help explain something curious about the whole pattern this section has been tracing. Touch fades, hearing fades, temperature fades, and in each case you can usually explain afterward, in ordinary words, exactly what faded and why. Smell fades too, by mechanisms that turn out to be strikingly similar underneath: receptor adaptation, higher-level habituation, the nervous system's general preference for change over steadiness. But when smell returns, standing in a doorway after a week away, the experience of it resists being pinned down quite as neatly, arriving less as information and more as feeling, which is perhaps why people so often describe the smell of their childhood home not in terms of what it consisted of, but in terms of what it did to them. That difficulty of description, the sense that smell keeps slipping just out of reach of language, even while sitting directly in the center of memory, turns out to connect to a much older puzzle, one that has occupied scientists and philosophers for a very long time. The question of why the human vocabulary for smell has always seemed so much thinner than the vocabulary for color, or sound, or taste, and whether that thinness reflects something about language or something about the nose itself.
Consider, for a moment, what a home's smell is actually made of, not as a single note, but as a slow accumulation of many small sources, each releasing its own quiet contribution into the shared air, layer upon layer, for years at a time. It helps to think less like a person entering a room and more like a chemist watching molecules drift and settle, because that, in essence, is what is happening every hour of every day, whether anyone is home to notice or not. Start with fabric, since fabric may be the single greatest reservoir of scent in most houses. Upholstery, curtains, carpets, the couch cushions that have absorbed a decade of afternoons, all of these are porous in a way that hard surfaces are not, riddled with countless microscopic fibers that trap airborne molecules the way a net traps water droplets in fog. A wool sweater left in a closet does not just sit there unchanged, it slowly draws in whatever is circulating nearby: cooking smoke from 3 winters ago, the mustiness of a damp basement, a trace of perfume worn only once. Natural fibers tend to hold scent more readily than synthetic ones, their surfaces more textured, more willing to let odor molecules nestle into tiny crevices and stay there, sometimes for years, releasing their contents slowly, the way a stone releases the day's heat long after the sun has gone down. Wood behaves in its own particular way, and old wood especially so. Wood is not sealed, not even when varnished, and over decades it breathes, absorbing moisture and organic compounds from the air and slowly releasing its own volatile chemicals in return, the faint sweetness of cellulose breaking down, the resinous ghost of whatever tree it once was. This is part of why very old houses, the kind with exposed beams or wide plank floors laid a century ago, tend to carry a smell that feels almost geological, less like a room and more like a forest that has been quietly aging indoors. Paint contributes too, though differently, and mostly in its early life. Fresh paint releases a burst of volatile organic compounds as it cures,
a smell most people know instantly, sharp and faintly sweet, and then, over the following weeks, that burst tapers into something almost undetectable, the paint essentially finishing its outgassing and settling into chemical quiet, though never entirely. A very old painted wall still has, if you press your face close enough, a whisper of its former sharpness. Books, curiously, have become one of the more studied sources of interior scent, in part because people care about them so much, and in part because the process turns out to be genuinely elegant. Paper is made mostly of cellulose and lignin, and as those compounds slowly break down over years, they release a cascade of smaller molecules, vanillin among them, the same compound responsible for the scent of vanilla, along with faint traces of almond and grass, and something resembling old wine. A single old book barely registers, but a shelf of them, or a whole room of them, compounds into something unmistakable, warm and papery and faintly sweet, a smell so specific that people who grew up around large home libraries often say they can recognize it blindfolded, decades later, in a completely different building. Then there is dust, which is not one thing, but an accumulation of nearly everything, a kind of slow-motion archive of a household's daily life. Dust is made of skin cells, fabric fibers, pollen, carried in on shoes, pet dander, soil particles, and microscopic fragments of whatever has been cooked, burned, or spilled inside the walls. Each component carries its own faint chemical signature, and together they form a background hum of scent, so constant that, as discussed earlier in this narration, the nervous system essentially stops registering it after a matter of minutes.
But dust is also, in its way, a physical record, and if you could somehow isolate and analyze the dust from a single home, you would be looking at a kind of chemical diary, an unintentional inventory of everything that has happened there. Cooking aerosols deserve particular attention because they behave differently from almost everything else on this list. When food is heated, especially at high temperatures, oils and fats vaporize into microscopic airborne droplets, not simple gas but tiny suspended particles, heavy enough that they do not simply disperse the way a gas would, light enough to travel and settle on nearby surfaces. This is why a kitchen that has fried food regularly for years often has a faint but persistent greasiness to its air even hours after cooking has stopped, and why curtains near a stove, or the tops of cabinets, tend to develop their own subtle patina of accumulated cooking scent over time, a slow, almost invisible varnish laid down one meal at a time. Human bodies contribute their own layer too, quieter but continuous. Skin hosts a whole ecosystem of bacteria, and much of what people think of as body odor is not sweat itself, which is largely odorless, but the metabolic byproducts of those bacteria breaking sweat down into smaller compounds. Every person's particular mixture of skin bacteria, diet, and genetics produces a scent signature that is, in its own way, almost as individual as a fingerprint, and a home occupied by the same people for years slowly becomes saturated with that particular signature in the sheets, the pillows, the collars of coats hung by the door. This is part of why a returning traveler sometimes describes their own childhood bed as smelling unmistakably like themselves or like their family, a scent so intimately familiar that it becomes essentially undetectable to the people who produced it and startlingly obvious to a stranger walking in for the first time. Pets add their own distinct contribution. sometimes considerable. Dogs, in particular, have skin oils and a coat structure that trap and slowly release odor, along with saliva, which carries its own bacterial population and the accumulated scent of everywhere they have walked and rolled and slept. Cats are generally quieter contributors, more fastidious groomers, though litter areas and marking behaviors can leave their own persistent traces, chemically potent even in very small quantities. Over years, a pet's presence becomes woven into a home's fabric almost as thoroughly as a person's, embedded in carpet fibers and under floorboards, sometimes lingering faintly for a surprisingly long time after the animal itself is gone. Moisture changes nearly everything about how all of these odors behave, because water vapor in the air acts as a kind of carrier, helping certain molecules travel further and bind more readily to surfaces. This is why smells tend to feel stronger and more present in humid conditions, a musty basement seeming far mustier after a rainy week, a bathroom holding the scent of soap and shampoo far longer when the air is thick with shower steam. Damp conditions also invite mold and mildew, organisms that produce their own distinct volatile compounds, an earthy, slightly sour note that many people recognize instantly even without knowing its chemical origin, the smell of a windowsill that stays wet too often, or a closet that never quite gets enough air. Airflow, in turn, governs how far and how evenly any of this travels. A house with good cross-ventilation, windows that open on opposite sides, doors that stay ajar, tends to have odors that move, dilute, and refresh more readily, never settling too heavily in any one place. A house that is sealed tight, especially in winter, allows odors to concentrate and layer, accumulating in still corners the way silt gathers in the slow bends of a river. This is part of why homes often smell noticeably different across seasons, not just because of what is happening outside, but because closed winter windows change the entire internal weather of a house, trapping cooking smoke, body scent, and pet dander together in a way that summer's open air simply does not allow. And so, by the time all of this is considered together, fabric and wood, and paint and paper, dust and cooking oil, and skin bacteria, pet fur and dampness, and the slow seasonal opening and closing of windows, it becomes almost obvious why every home ends up with its own singular scent signature, as unrepeatable as a fingerprint, built from thousands of small, ordinary sources layered patiently over years. What is far less obvious, and considerably stranger, is why the person living inside that accumulation is so often the last one able to perceive it at all, a question that leads naturally toward the particular and finicky biology of adaptation itself, and how a nervous system decides, moment to moment, what in its environment still deserves its attention. Think for a moment about walking into a friend's house for the first time. Before you've even set down your bag, before a word of greeting has fully left your mouth, something registers. A faint impression that this place smells like cedar, or like a dog that sheds heavily, or like someone in the household bakes often. Your friend, standing right beside you in the same air, notices nothing. They aren't being polite when they say they don't know what you mean. They genuinely cannot access what you're describing, not in that moment, perhaps not for years, because their nervous system made a quiet decision about that smell long before you ever arrived. This is the visitor's advantage, and it has almost nothing to do with a better nose. A guest's olfactory receptors are, in most ordinary cases, no more sensitive than the resident's. What differs is history. The resident's nervous system has been marinating in that particular chemical soup for months or years, and somewhere along the way, it stopped sending fresh alerts about it, the way a person who lives beside a train track eventually stops hearing the trains. The visitor's receptors, by contrast, are meeting those molecules for the first time, or at least for the first time in a while, so they fire with the full enthusiasm of novelty. It's less a difference in equipment, and more a difference in what each nervous system has decided is worth reporting. But here, something curious happens, something that trips people up if they haven't thought about it before. Two visitors, standing in the same doorway, breathing the same air, can disagree entirely about what they smell, or whether they smell anything unusual at all. One says, "The house smells like a candle shop." Another shrugs and says, "It just smells like a house." This isn't one of them lying, and it isn't necessarily one of them having a superior nose either. It's a reminder that smell perception is built from at least two separate ingredients, and those ingredients vary enormously from person to person. The first ingredient is detection, the raw biological ability to notice that a molecule is present at all. The second is interpretation, the labeling and meaning-making that happens once a signal reaches the brain. Two people can detect the exact same molecule at the exact same concentration and still walk away with entirely different impressions, because their brains are drawing on different libraries of memory, language, and prior exposure to make sense of it. Genetics plays a surprisingly large role in that first ingredient, detection itself. Each person carries several hundred genes devoted to building olfactory receptors, and there is real variation among people in which versions of those genes they carry, and therefore in which molecules they can detect easily, faintly, or not at all. Some of this has been studied closely. A compound found in certain evergreen woods, and in some cat urine, for instance, is perceived strongly by some people and is essentially undetectable to others, a gap tied directly to differences in a single receptor gene. Cilantro's soapy taste for some people, and its bright herbal taste for others, traces back to similar genetic variation in taste and smell receptors working together. So when someone insists a room smells strongly of something, and another person insists it doesn't, both may be telling the truth about their own perceptual world, simply because their receptor genetics quietly diverged somewhere back in their family history, long before either of them ever stepped into that house. Age changes the picture too, gradually and often without much notice from the person experiencing it. Olfactory receptor cells are unusual among human sensory cells in that they regenerate throughout life, replaced every few weeks by new cells growing up from a layer of stem cells at the base of the nasal lining. But that regenerative process slows as people get older, and the total population of working receptor cells tends to decline, along with some loss of function in the brain regions that interpret their signals. This is why many people in their 70s and 80s report smells as fainter and less richly detailed than they remember from earlier decades, a fading that happens slowly enough that it can be difficult to notice until it's pointed out, perhaps by a grandchild remarking on a smell the older relative simply cannot perceive. Illness intervenes in more abrupt and sometimes more dramatic ways. A common cold, with its swelling and mucus, can block airflow to the receptors entirely for a few days. A mechanical problem, rather than a nerve problem, resolved as soon as the congestion clears. But other conditions interfere with the nerves and pathways themselves. Certain viral infections have been known to damage olfactory tissue directly.
sometimes leading to smell loss that lingers long after the illness has otherwise passed, or to a strange distortion called parosmia, in which familiar smells arrive twisted into something unpleasant. Coffee smelling like burning rubber, for example, a phenomenon that researchers are still working to fully explain. Neurological conditions, including some that affect memory and movement in older adults, have also been linked to smell changes that in some cases appear years before other, more commonly recognized symptoms show up, which is part of why smell has become an area of serious scientific interest, well beyond simple curiosity about home odors. Smoking, too, leaves its mark, and in more than one way. It coats the nasal lining and dulls the sensitivity of receptor cells over time, so that longtime smokers often detect background odors, including their own home smell, less readily than non-smokers do. And ironically, this same reduced sensitivity is part of why a smoker's home so often smells powerfully of smoke to everyone else, while the resident insists there's barely a trace. The smoke has, in effect, recalibrated what counts as neutral for that particular nose, the way staring at a bright light recalibrates what counts as dim once you look away. Medications add another layer of complexity, one that surprises people who've never thought to connect their prescriptions to their sense of smell.
Certain blood pressure medications, some antibiotics, and a number of other common drugs have been associated with changes in smell perception, sometimes dulling it, occasionally distorting it, and the effects vary widely depending on the specific medication and the individual taking it. It's rarely dramatic enough for someone to notice consciously, but it can shift, subtly, how strongly a house registers to the person living in it. Hormones move through this story too, quietly but measurably. Many people report heightened smell sensitivity during pregnancy, sometimes to an almost overwhelming degree, certain cooking smells or perfumes becoming suddenly intolerable in ways they never were before. The menstrual cycle has also been associated with small fluctuations in smell sensitivity in some studies, though the effect size and consistency vary between individuals and are still debated among researchers. What's fairly well agreed upon is that the olfactory system isn't a fixed, unchanging instrument. It's responsive to the body's broader chemical state, rising and falling somewhat in tandem with shifts that have nothing to do with the nose itself. And then there is the matter of prior experience and cultural learning, which shapes not detection so much as interpretation, that second ingredient mentioned earlier. A smell that one person associates with comfort, a grandmother's kitchen, a particular brand of soap used throughout childhood, might strike someone with no such history as merely unfamiliar or even faintly unpleasant. The molecules haven't changed. What differs is the emotional and cultural scaffolding built around them over years of exposure, associations laid down so early and so repeatedly that the smell and the feeling become almost inseparable. This is part of why one person can walk into a relative's house and feel an immediate, wordless sense of home, while another visitor, breathing the same air, experiences it as simply an unfamiliar smell, neither good nor bad, just different, a smell without a story attached to it yet. All of which begins to suggest that a house's scent was never really one fixed thing waiting to be measured, but something closer to a negotiation, worked out differently in every nervous system that encounters it, shaped by genes inherited long before anyone chose a home, by years quietly accumulating or fading, by illness,
by habit, by chemistry moving through the blood, and by memories laid down so long ago they no longer feel like memories at all. It's worth turning next to what happens when that negotiation breaks down altogether, when the nose stops sending signals almost entirely, and what that silence can mean.
There's a particular kind of surprise that happens when a smell arrives before the memory does. Someone opens a box that's been sealed in an attic for 20 years, and before a single thought forms, before any conscious recognition, there's already a feeling. Sometimes it's warmth. Sometimes, oddly, it's a kind of dread, unplaced and immediate. Only afterward does the mind catch up and supply the story. This was the smell of a grandfather's workshop, or a summer camp, or a hospital hallway visited only once but never forgotten. The feeling arrives first. The explanation follows. This ordering is not an accident of how memory happens to work with smell. It reflects something about the actual wiring inside the skull, a piece of anatomy that makes olfaction unlike every other sense in a way that's worth sitting with slowly, because it explains so much of why a childhood home can feel instantly, almost unbearably present after years away, while a photograph of the same house, however detailed, rarely produces anything like the same jolt. To understand why, it helps to think for a moment about how other senses reach the brain: light hitting the retina, sound reaching the eardrum, pressure against the skin. All of this information travels first to a structure called the thalamus, which acts something like a switchboard operator, or perhaps more accurately, a customs official, checking incoming signals and routing them onward to the appropriate processing centers before anything reaches the parts of the brain responsible for emotion and memory. It's an extra step, a layer of relay and delay, however brief. Smell skips it. Olfactory signals travel from receptors in the nose almost directly into the olfactory bulb, and from there into structures that sit deep in the brain's temporal lobes, structures with names that sound almost architectural: the amygdala, seat of much emotional processing, and the hippocampus, central to the formation of long-term memory. These structures are neighbors. They are, in evolutionary terms, some of the oldest architecture the brain has, present in some form in creatures whose ancestors were sniffing out food and danger long before anything resembling a human eye had evolved to see color, long before ears had refined themselves for language. Smell reached the emotional and memory centers of the brain before the brain had much else going on at all, and that ancient wiring never got rerouted, even as vision and hearing built themselves elaborate, more circuitous pathways on top of it. This proximity is why a smell can trigger a memory with a kind of force that feels different from the way a photograph or a song triggers one. A photograph is processed visually first, categorized, compared, analyzed for content before any emotional resonance gets attached to it, and that analysis takes a certain kind of measured, deliberate cognitive work. A smell seems to bypass that deliberation almost entirely. It doesn't wait for permission. It arrives already carrying feeling, because the anatomical road it travels runs straight through the parts of the brain that specialize in feeling and remembering rather than past them. This is sometimes described, informally, as the Proust phenomenon, named for a French novelist who wrote, in the early 20th century, about the taste of a small cake dipped in tea, unlocking a flood of childhood memory so vivid and so involuntary that it seemed to arrive from nowhere.
The description has held up remarkably well against later scientific investigation, which is somewhat unusual, since novelists are not typically in the business of anticipating neuroscience by the better part of a century.
Studies comparing memories triggered by smells against memories triggered by words or images describing the same objects have generally found that odor-triggered memories tend to feel older, more emotionally intense, and more tied to a specific, particular moment in time, even when the events being remembered happened just as long ago either way. Something about the pathway itself seems to preserve a kind of rawness in the memory that other routes into the brain tend to smooth over. None of this explains, entirely, why a childhood home specifically produces such a strong version of this effect, but a few things about childhood homes make them almost perfectly suited to the phenomenon. For one, the exposure is long and repeated, often daily, across years, during which the brain itself is unusually plastic, still laying down the deep architecture of what will become adult memory and adult emotional association. A smell encountered thousands of times during childhood, the particular mixture of a specific detergent, a specific style of cooking, the material a couch was upholstered in, the dampness of a basement, becomes woven into memory with a thoroughness that later, more occasional smells rarely achieve. For another, childhood homes are typically left only once, and left behind completely, so the smell doesn't get diluted or reconstructed the way, say, an office smell might, revisited weekly for years, updated and layered over itself repeatedly. A childhood home, once departed, becomes sealed in memory, much the way a scent gets sealed inside an old cardboard box, undisturbed, unrefreshed, waiting. And then there's the particular emotional situation of returning after a long absence. Adult brains have accumulated so much additional experience, so many competing associations, that few things retain the power to instantly transport a person back to an earlier, simpler emotional state. Smell seems to be one of the few things that can do it reliably, partly because that ancient, thalamus-skipping pathway hasn't changed, hasn't been rerouted by adulthood the way conscious thought has. Walking back into a childhood bedroom, smelling the particular mustiness of old carpet or the specific brand of soap still sitting in the same dish, can produce a feeling of being, briefly, exactly as old as the last time that smell was encountered in that context. This is sometimes described by people who've had the experience as disorienting, even slightly frightening, a sense of time folding in on itself for just a moment before ordinary adult awareness reasserts control. This same mechanism, though, explains something less dramatic, but perhaps more relevant to everyday domestic life. Why familiar household smells so often carry emotional weight that has very little to do with the smell itself, and much more to do with what it's become attached to over time. The smell of a particular cleaning product might be, on a purely chemical level, unremarkable, yet it might trigger comfort in one person because it was the smell of a parent's care, or trigger something closer to tension in another person because it was the smell of a household where care and tension were, for whatever reason, tangled together. Two people can encounter molecularly identical scents and have entirely different emotional experiences of them, not because their noses differ, though sometimes they do, but because the memory and emotion centers each smell is wired into differ enormously from one nervous system to the next. This is also, in part, why domestic smells can feel embarrassing in a way that's somewhat particular to smell,
and doesn't quite have an equivalent in other senses. The idea that one's own home might smell a certain way to visitors, a way its residents can no longer perceive because of adaptation, can prompt a kind of low-grade anxiety, precisely because smell is so tightly bound to judgment, to memory, to the emotional impressions people form of each other and of the spaces they live in. Nobody worries much about whether the color of their walls has become invisible to them through habituation, but the possibility of an odor becoming invisible, one that a visitor might silently register and privately judge, touches something closer to identity, because scent has always been so entangled, biologically and culturally, with intimacy and with the private, unguarded parts of domestic life. And this is perhaps also why familiar smells can feel simultaneously comforting and entirely unnoticed. The paradox that opened this exploration many sections ago. A smell fully absorbed into memory, fully wired into the emotional architecture of a particular place and a particular sense of belonging, doesn't need to be consciously perceived in order to do its work. It can operate quietly, in the background, contributing to a feeling of ease or safety, without ever announcing itself, without ever rising to the threshold of attention. This is not so different from the way a familiar piece of background music can shape a mood, without anyone consciously listening to it, except that smell, given its unusually direct route to memory and emotion, may do this even more effectively, coloring a sense of home from somewhere just below awareness. There is, though, a quieter possibility lurking behind all of this, one that becomes harder to ignore the older a person gets. If smell's power depends so heavily on this ancient, direct wiring between nose and memory and feeling, what happens when that wiring itself begins to fail, not gradually fading the way habituation fades a smell within a single afternoon, but disappearing more thoroughly, sometimes for weeks, sometimes permanently? That question turns the conversation toward something different from adaptation or memory, toward the experience of losing the sense of smell altogether, and what that unexpected silence can reveal about how much of daily life had been quietly resting on it all along.
It's worth pausing here to gently correct something the last section may have left hanging in the wrong shape. The temporary invisibility of a home's smell, the nose blindness that settles over a kitchen or a hallway within minutes of walking through the door, is not the same thing as damage, and it is not the same thing as the more serious losses just mentioned. This distinction matters enough to sit with for a moment, slowly, because the two phenomena share a surface resemblance that can cause needless worry if left unexamined. A person who no longer notices their own home's particular scent has not injured anything. Nothing in the nose has broken. No receptor has burned out. The sensory neurons responsible for that particular smell are, in almost every ordinary case, working exactly as they should, faithfully reporting the same unchanging signal they reported an hour ago, and it is the brain, further upstream, that has simply stopped forwarding that report to conscious attention, the way a night shift worker might stop hearing a familiar hum from a refrigerator after the first few minutes on the job, not because their ears have failed, but because their attention has, sensibly, moved elsewhere. This kind of adaptation reverses itself as easily as it arrives. Step outside for 20 minutes, walk to a mailbox and back, run an errand at a shop with entirely different air, and the moment of re-entry restores the smell almost exactly as it was, sometimes even more vividly than before, because the nose, having had a small rest, responds to the reintroduced molecules with renewed enthusiasm. This happens every single day, in every home, for every person, and it happens without any lasting consequence at all. It is closer to the eye adjusting to a dim room than to any kind of hearing loss or nerve damage. The mechanism is protective and temporary, tuned by evolution to keep attention available for whatever might be new or different in the environment, and it asks nothing more of a person than patience and a bit of fresh air. But here is where the story needs to slow down and be told with more care, because there is a very human tendency to take a comforting fact and stretch it further than it was ever meant to go. If nose blindness to a familiar candle or a particular laundry detergent is harmless, it becomes tempting to assume that the same forgiving logic applies to everything the nose stops registering, that adaptation is a general kind of safety, a sign that whatever has gone unnoticed must therefore be unimportant. This is not true, and it was never true, and untangling why is one of the more practically useful things a person can carry away from an evening spent thinking about the strange workings of smell. Adaptation dulls the signal, but it says nothing at all about the danger of what produced that signal in the first place. A gas leak, for instance, the kind that utility companies deliberately give an odor to using a compound called mercaptan, precisely because natural gas itself has no scent at all, can become less noticeable to someone who has been sitting in a room with a slow leak for an extended period, even as the concentration in the air continues to climb. The nose adapting to that rotten egg smell does not mean the leak is stabilizing or resolving. It means only that the brain has quieted its own alarm bell while the underlying condition, unaffected by anyone's perception of it, goes on exactly as before. This is one of the genuine, practical reasons that gas leak safety guidance has never relied on smell alone, and why detectors exist that do not get bored, that do not adapt, that simply measure and report without any of the psychological machinery that makes the human nose such an efficient but sometimes misleading instrument. And then there is the case that deserves to be named, plainly, gently, but without any softening, because it is the clearest illustration of why smell can never be fully trusted as a safety system on its own. Carbon monoxide has no odor whatsoever, none. It is not a smell that fades with exposure or grows faint with time, because there was never a smell to begin with. The gas is colorless as well, and for that matter tasteless, which means that none of the traditional senses a person might instinctively lean on for a warning are of any use at all. This is precisely why carbon monoxide has earned its old, grim nickname of the silent killer, a phrase that sounds almost theatrical until one considers how literally accurate it is. A faulty furnace, a blocked chimney flue, a car left running in an attached garage, a charcoal grill brought indoors during a power outage. Any of these can fill a home with a gas that offers no sensory clue of its presence whatsoever, no rotten smell, no visible haze, nothing that the nose, however well rested and however attentive, could ever be expected to catch. This single fact is the reason carbon monoxide detectors exist as a category of device entirely separate from smoke detectors, built around a different chemical sensing mechanism, because no amount of nasal vigilance could ever substitute for one. It is one of the few areas of home safety where relying on human senses was never even a reasonable option to begin with, and the invention of a mechanical answer, small and unglamorous as it often looks, mounted on a hallway wall, has quietly saved a great many lives since detectors became commonly available in the final years of the 20th century. So the two ideas sit side by side
without contradiction, if a person takes the time to actually look at them together. The nose is a genuinely remarkable instrument, capable of astonishing feats of discrimination, wired directly into memory and emotion in ways that still surprise researchers who spend their careers studying it. And at the very same time, it is not a comprehensive alarm system, not something a household can lean on for every category of danger, particularly not for a gas that leaves no trace on it at all. Trusting the nose for some things, and installing a small battery-powered device for others, is not a failure of faith in the body's senses. It is simply an accurate accounting of what those senses were built to do, and what they were never built to do, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressures that had nothing whatsoever to do with modern combustion engines or gas-fired furnaces.
There is one more thread worth drawing out gently before this particular part of the story closes, and it concerns something different from either everyday adaptation or the specific blind spot of carbon monoxide. It has to do with changes in smell that are neither the ordinary fading of a familiar scent nor the complete and permanent absence of one, but something in between, something that shows up as a genuine shift and tends, understandably, to prompt a bit of quiet concern. A persistent, unusual odor that seems to come from nowhere in particular, one that doesn't match anything actually present in a room, or a sudden and pronounced loss of smell that arrives without an obvious cause like a common cold, are both the kinds of changes that deserve a conversation with a doctor rather than an attempt at self-diagnosis in the small hours of the night. This is not meant as a note of alarm, and it isn't offered here to turn a calm exploration of the senses into a source of worry right before sleep. It is only an honest acknowledgement that the nose, wired as intimately as it is into memory and mood, is also wired into deeper neurological processes, and that changes in how it functions can occasionally be an early signal worth paying attention to, in the same unremarkable way that any persistent change in vision or hearing might be worth mentioning at a routine appointment. Most such changes turn out to have simple, ordinary explanations, but the appropriate response to something unusual and lasting is a conversation with someone qualified to look into it, not a spiral of guesswork, and certainly not a decision to ignore it simply because smell so often operates below the threshold of conscious attention anyway. With that settled, gently, and without any need to dwell on it further, the conversation can turn towards something a little more elemental, a little further back in the evolutionary story than furnaces, or detectors, or even memory itself, toward the very old, very basic reasons a nose evolved to do any of this work in the first place. A nose, at its most basic, is an old solution to an old problem. Long before there were words for smell, long before there were brains complex enough to feel nostalgia at the scent of a childhood kitchen, there were simple organisms drifting or crawling through water and mud, and they needed some way of answering a question that never really goes away for any living thing. The question was this: what is out there, and is it food, or is it danger, or is it neither, and therefore safe to ignore? That is the whole of it, really. Everything elaborate that came later, the 1,000 types of receptors, the intricate folding of the olfactory bulb, the strange and moving way a smell can pull up a memory fully formed, all of it grew out of that one plain, practical need. A cell that could detect a chemical in its environment and respond by moving toward it or away from it had an advantage over a cell that could not. That is the entire seed from which this whole nightly conversation has grown. And it is worth sitting with that origin for a moment, because it explains so much of what has already been discussed across this long, slow unwinding of the subject. It explains why the nose is built to notice change rather than to catalog constancy. An organism that spent its limited attention re-registering the same harmless, ever-present chemical signature over and over would be an organism poorly equipped to notice the one new thing that mattered: the sudden, acrid tang of smoke, the faint sourness of spoiling food, the trace of a predator's scent carried on the wind. So, evolution, working across unthinkable stretches of time, favored noses that adapt. It favored receptors that would answer strongly to a new molecule, and then, if that molecule kept showing up, quiet themselves down, freeing up the system's attention for whatever might come next. This is receptor adaptation, and it happens right at the front line, out at the very tips of those nerve cells tucked high in the nasal cavity, where a specific receptor exposed to a specific molecule for a sustained stretch of time will simply produce a smaller and smaller signal, the molecular machinery essentially shrugging at a message it has already delivered. But that is only the first layer, and it was never the whole answer, because a person's own home does not vanish from awareness merely because a few thousand receptors have gone quiet. The story continues upward, into the brain itself, where a second, and in some ways more interesting kind of adjustment takes place. The olfactory bulb, and the deeper regions connected to it, do not merely receive whatever raw signal the nose sends up and pass it along unfiltered to conscious awareness. They edit. They compare incoming information against a kind of running expectation, a working model of what the immediate environment is supposed to smell like, built up over minutes and hours and, in the case of a home, over years. When incoming signal matches that expectation closely enough, the brain treats it as old news and dampens it further, not because the receptors have gone silent, but because the significance has been judged low and the resources of attention have been reassigned elsewhere. This is habituation, and it sits one level higher than adaptation, more central, more woven into learning and memory than into the simple mechanics of a nerve ending, and together the two form a kind of double filter, one at the gate and one further inside the house, both agreeing, in their own separate ways, that the same old smell does not need to be shouted about anymore. Attention, it turns out, is the resource all of this machinery is really protecting. A person can only consciously attend to so much at once, and the senses compete, quietly and constantly, for a limited share of that attention. Vision tends to win a great deal of that competition simply because so much of what matters to a modern human life arrives through the eyes, but smell has never entirely surrendered its share, and there is a particular kind of proof in what happens when it is allowed back in. Step outside into cold air for even a few minutes, run an errand down the street, breathe unfamiliar air at a shop or a neighbor's porch, and then come back through the front door, and for a handful of seconds, sometimes less, the home's whole scent will present itself again, whole and unmistakable, before fading back into the background within moments. That flicker of return is not the nose rediscovering something it forgot. It is the receptors, freshly reset by absence, briefly firing at full strength again, and the brain, momentarily surprised by input that no longer matches its dulled expectation, granting it one last flash of attention before folding it back into the ordinary, unremarked hum of the familiar.
This is why absence works so reliably as a kind of soft reset, and why anyone who has ever come home from even a short trip has felt this precise, gentle jolt of recognition, that instant where a house announces itself all at once, through smell, before politely going quiet again. It is one of the more charming demonstrations of how perception actually works, not as a passive recording of the world, but as an active, ongoing negotiation between what is out there and what the brain has already decided is worth noticing. None of this exists apart from memory, and this may be the loveliest thread running through the whole subject. Smell connects to memory and emotion by a route that is almost architecturally different from how the other senses connect. More direct, less filtered through the newer, more analytical parts of the brain that handle language and logic. This is part of why a particular scent can summon a childhood afternoon whole and complete, mood and light and all, faster and more vividly than a photograph ever could. And it is also, quietly, part of why a person's own home smells like almost nothing to them at all.
That specific blend of laundry soap and old wood, and whatever quiet mixture of cooking and dust and family, has settled into the walls over years. It was memorized so long ago and so thoroughly that it no longer needs redetecting. It has become part of the baseline against which everything else in life is measured, not absent exactly, but so deeply known that it has stopped requiring announcement. There is something worth appreciating in this rather than something worth mourning. It would be exhausting, not comforting, to walk through one's own kitchen and have every familiar note demand fresh attention the way it did the very first time. The nervous system's willingness to let the known recede into the background is not a flaw in the design. It is the design working exactly as intended, a filter built across an immense stretch of evolutionary time to let the mind rest on what is safe and settled, so that its limited and precious attention stays free for whatever is new, whatever is different, whatever might actually need a response. A guest walking through the door experiences the fullness of that smell precisely because their nervous system has not yet decided it is safe to ignore. And in time, if they stayed long enough, their own receptors and their own expectations would begin the same quiet process of settling, until they too would need to step outside and come back in to catch even a brief trace of what once seemed unmistakable. So the confusing thing about not being able to smell one's own home turns out, after all this slow unwinding, not to be very confusing at all, once each piece is given its proper place. Receptors adapt to constant exposure by softening their own signal. The brain habituates, learning that a steady, familiar pattern of information carries little urgent value, and choosing, gently and continuously, to let it fade toward the background. Attention is a finite resource, spent where it is needed most, rarely on what has already proven safe and unchanging. Absence and return offer a brief, honest glimpse of what the senses are actually doing all the time, resetting and recalibrating in the dark, without any need for conscious instruction. And underneath all of it, memory keeps its own quiet ledger, filing away what is known so deeply that it no longer requires notice, freeing up the mind for whatever the next unfamiliar moment might bring. None of this is a flaw or a loss. It is a kind of quiet, generous economy, the nervous system managing its limited attention with a wisdom built over an almost unimaginable span of time, letting go of what is safe and known so that it can stay alert to what might still matter. The home has not disappeared. It has simply been folded, molecule by molecule, breath by breath,
into the deep and steady background hum of everything already understood, everything already trusted, everything that no longer needs to ask for attention because it has already, so many times before, been given all the attention it will ever need. Rest well.